Today we're going to talk about how to connect leadership with ethics, and afterwards we're going to do some cases on workplace ethics and leadership. Now there's three ways to connect leadership with ethics. The first way is what we call amoral, in other words, without morals. So in other words, we don't think about morals at all or ethics at all in leadership. We just talk about leadership theories. A second way is where we talk about the values of the leader, virtue ethics. You know, the leader has certain virtues or positive character traits. And the third way is what we call ethical vision or ethical leadership, where the leader inspires the followers to towards an ethical goal or to have an ethical culture. Now, with amoral leadership, we're just talking about leadership in terms of the effectiveness as a leader, as someone who can attain certain goals or objectives of the organization. We're not talking about ethics at all. Now, the problem with amoral leadership is you can't make a distinction between, say, a leader like Hitler, who was a madman from World War II and responsible for the extermination of millions of Jews, and Gandhi, who was a leader who used non-violent means to achieve India's independence from British rule. Now, from a purely amoral leadership point of view, in other words, leadership without ethics, Hitler was a good leader. I mean, after all, he achieved his goals. He led armies to conquer Europe. Popular leadership theories include trait theories, which looks at the personality traits of a leader, psychodynamic theories, which looks at the motivations of the leader and the followers, and then situational theories, which looks at the styles of leadership, Well, let's take a moment right now and talk about what is your leadership style. Leadership styles is an amoral ethical theory which looks at three main leadership styles: the autocratic, the democratic, and the laissez-faire. Now, as I say, being a amoral style, it's not talking about ethics, but what we can do is we can add an ethical component into each of these styles. But let's first of all determine which style you prefer. So I want you to think about your past experience as a leader, perhaps as a supervisor at work, or even as a student group leader. But even if you don't have too much leadership experience, I want you to think about what you would prefer as a leader if you were leading a team or leading staff members. So do these statements describe you? So her first statement: I hold the final decision-making authority within my department and rarely consider suggestions made by my staff. I tell my staff what has to be done and how to do it. Now, would you say, A, I do this most of the time, B, I do this occasionally, or C, I hardly ever do this? Now, if you answer, I do this most of the time, you tend to be an autocratic or authoritarian leader. Do what I say, no questions asked. You like to boss people around. You like to be in charge. So how many of you are autocratic leaders here? Now let's consider the second style. Do these statements apply to you? When a decision must be made, I include other staff members in determining what to do and how to do it. After asking for ideas and input, I make the final decision. So would you do this A, I do this most of the time, or B, I do this occasionally, or C, I hardly ever do this? Now, if you answered most of the time, you tend to be a democratic or participative leader. You like to ask your followers, what do you think? You like to get the input from your followers and get their ideas, and then you make the final decision. Now, this can be a good style because when people have input into a decision, they tend to support it. Now let's take a look at the third leadership style and consider these two statements. For a major decision to pass in my department, it must have the approval of each individual or the majority. I allow my staff to determine what needs to be done and how to do it. So would you do this A, most of the time, or B, I do this occasionally, or C, I hardly ever do this? So if you answered most of the time, you tend to be a laissez-faire leader. Do your own thing. I give you the freedom to do your job in your own way. I may give you some guidelines, but pretty much you do your own thing. Now, some of you may think, well, that's not a very good leadership style, but in fact, it can be a good leadership style. For example, here at Seneca, the leader of or manager of professors should be more of a laissez-faire type leader. As a professor, I don't want to be told how to teach or what methods to use or what to do. I pretty much want to teach in my own way. So a laissez-faire leadership style works well with highly trained professionals who are capable and know what they are doing. So these are the three main leadership styles in this theory. Now, as I said, this is really an amoral theory in the sense that it really doesn't consider ethics or values in leadership, or we don't talk about, how to motivate people in an ethical way. However, we can add an additional style or a more ethical style to any one of these styles to add an ethical component. That's why I say that there are three leadership styles plus one. We can add an ethical component to any one of these styles to become a more ethical leader. So consider these three statements. I like to create a pleasant workplace environment for my employees. I like my employees to see me as friendly and approachable and show concern for their status, needs, and well-being. I encourage and reward them for doing the right thing. So would you want to do this most of the time? Or B, I do this occasionally? Or C, I hardly ever do this? So if you can do this most of the time, you can be a supportive, caring, and ethical leader. And this type of leader says, I'm here to give you psychological, emotional support and encouragement to be a better employee and a better ethical person. And this style can be integrated into the three main styles. So again, whatever style you use, an ethical style treats employees in a fair and ethical manner. You don't overly stress them because you care about them as human beings. You don't use deception or fear tactics to manipulate them to get your people to do what you want them to do. So let's go back to the three styles for a moment. And leadership style says the right style depends on the situation. Now, a lot of people say, well, the authoritarian, autocratic style is not good because you're bossing people around. But I want you to think for a moment. Can you think of a situation when a strong authoritarian, autocratic style is needed? Well, if you guessed the Army, you're right. This is an order. Some of you also mentioned the police or firefighters, paramedics. See, these are all situations where you need fast, immediate, quick action. In the Army, the commanding officer doesn't ask his soldiers, well, how many of you think we should storm that house to get the bad guy? No, of course not. He's not going to say, well, let's get your input and let's take a vote here. No, of course not. He's going to say, storm that house and get the bad guy right now. This is an order. So amoral leadership style doesn't add ethics or values into leadership. It doesn't ask questions such as, is the outcome desirable? In other words, a leader can have an evil goal, as Hitler did. It doesn't ask the question, are the tools used ethically sound? I mean, a leader can use unethical tools like fear, intimidation, deception in order to motivate his followers. And also, should followers know how the leader is motivating them? As a follower, I would not want my leader manipulating me through deception and unethical means. And finally, how can we distinguish a good leader from a bad leader? In amoral leadership, well, we can't distinguish between a leader, let's say Hitler versus Gandhi. That's why ethical support and moral values and ethical vision should be integrated into leadership styles to create a moral, not an amoral type of leadership. So ethical leadership includes values-based leadership, where the leader displays values and virtues. Remember, virtue ethics. A leader is honest and trustworthy. He respects the followers, and the followers will respect him or her. And in this way, the leader can gain the trust and loyalty of his or her followers. A leadership professor by the name of Gardner says that the power of leadership can be used for evil or good. For example, in Hitler, he brought out the evil in his followers. But on the other hand, moral leaders use their power to release human potential and instill a sense of responsibility in their followers. And ethical leaders, they set a vision which is built on values and morals. I want to give you some examples of the power of vision. Here is the first Apple computer, very high tech in the 70s. This guy, Steve Wozniak, he built that first Apple computer in the 1970s. But it was Steve Jobs who had the vision to sell that computer to the masses. I still remember in 2011, after Steve Jobs passed away, I was watching an interview with Steve Wozniak, the guy who built the computer, on the Business Channel. And the reporter asked Wozniak, "Does Steve Jobs recognize your contribution to Apple? After all, you built that first computer." And Wozniak, he said, "Yes, I did build that first computer, but there would be no Apple without Steve Jobs." See, Wozniak, he was a technological genius. I mean, he was even more genius in terms of technology, more so than Steve Jobs. But he didn't have any of the marketing skills or vision to sell this computer to the masses. It was Steve Jobs who had that vision to say, hey, this is something that can be sold to every household in America. The McDonald's brothers invented the fast food hamburger. But if you go to the McDonald's website and you look up who is the founder of McDonald's, you're not going to see the McDonald's brothers as the founders. And you say, well, that's strange. I mean, after all, the restaurant's named after them. It's called McDonald's. But in fact, Ray Kroc is called the founder of McDonald's because it was Ray Kroc who had the vision to sell billions of burgers, and he's the one who is credited as the founder of McDonald's. Now, we all know the name Tim Horton. Now, he had a donut shop in Hamilton, not far from Toronto, and it was struggling to survive. Tim Horton's donut shop didn't take off until he went into partnership with this guy, Ron Joyce, because Ron Joyce had the vision to make Tim Hortons a Canadian icon. Larry Page and Sergey Brin invented a new search engine, and you probably know what that search engine is, Google. But it was Eric Schmidt that had a vision of what Google could become. He figured out a way for Google to make money. And so he became CEO, and he is the one who made Google. A lot of people don't realize that electric cars have been around for a long time, long before Tesla. But back then, electric cars were considered impractical, slow, limited in driving range, too expensive, and ugly, as you can see here. It was Elon Musk who had the vision to make electric cars that were high performance, stylish and cool, feasible and low cost for the masses. It was Elon Musk who said, well, we can compete with the big car companies at the time, like General Motors and even the luxury car makers like BMW. So he transformed Tesla into the most valuable car company in the world, surpassing Toyota. So I use these examples to show you it wasn't the inventor of the product, but rather it was the leaders with a vision to sell the products to the masses that was the key to company growth. So Gardner acknowledges the power of vision in leadership. But Gardner goes on to say that ethical leadership sets a vision built on values and morals, not just on selling the product. For example, in 1902, George Draper Dayton set a vision based on the value of the higher ground of stewardship. Stewardship is about responsible management and giving back. So his store soon becomes known for dependable merchandise, fair business practices, and a generous spirit of giving. This is the downtown Dayton Hudson store in downtown Chicago. My mom and my wife used to work there. The Dayton Hudson Corporate Constitution says, "The business of business is about serving society, not just making money." Now that's in contrast to what Milton Friedman said, who said, The one and only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Today, the most popular Dayton store is Target, which was started by Dayton's grandson. Target became known as the discount store with style. Target continues to follow the ethical vision and values of its founder, Mr. Dayton. And one of the values is that generous spirit of giving. So Mr. Dayton started a tradition that he would give 5% of the company's earnings to charity every year. Steinfeld became CEO of Target in 2008, the year the Great Recession began to set in. But despite sinking sales figures, Steinfeld chose to continue the retailer's long-standing practice of donating 5% of the company's earnings to charity. Leadership expert McGregor talks about transformational leadership. He says leaders mobilize followers to higher levels of moral development. They set an ethical vision, and they build an ethical culture in the company. For example, Howard Schultz, founder of Starbucks, says business at its best is not about just making a profit. It's about achieving the fragile balance between the fiscal responsibility that we have to our shareholders and to our constituencies, as well as our commitment to benevolence and to the people in our communities that we represent. Schultz goes on to say, if you treat people like family, you will make them loyal and encourage them to give their all. When a company cares, it rubs off somehow on its customer, who will gladly return and keep on coming back for Starbucks coffee. Now, Starbucks is an employee-focused company, in contrast to Walmart, which is customer-focused. But Howard Schultz believed that if you take care of the employee will take care of the customer. Now, Howard Schultz doesn't just talk about ethical values, he models them. He sets the example. In July 8th, 1997, there was a brutal slaying at Starbucks. 3 employees were killed by robbers, brutally murdered. And the press release here says, Washington, D.C., the discovery yesterday of the brutal slayings of 3 Starbucks coffee employees in Georgetown has shocked the Java chain at the highest ranks. Chief Executive Officer Schultz immediately flew here to console his employees and the victims' families. Now, Howard Schultz was on vacation, but immediately he broke off his vacation. He flew to Washington, and his first stop was not to talk to the press or do crisis management. His first priority was to go and console the victims' families. He went immediately to the families of the victims and offered his condolences. See, his number one goal yesterday was to talk to the family of the victims. So you can see that Howard Schultz treated his employees like family. Schultz believes in treating people with fairness and equality. Not only treating his employees that way, but he also believes in marriage equality, gay and transgender rights. At a shareholders meeting, a shareholder stood up and criticized Schultz for supporting gay rights. And Howard Schultz simply said, if you don't like marriage equality, feel free to sell your Starbucks stock. So ethical leadership integrates ethics and values in all 4 variables of the leadership model. The leader displays ethical values and character. The leader inspires followers and transforms them with ethical vision. The leader practices leadership skills in an ethical manner, doesn't use deception or manipulation. And finally, no matter what leadership style the leader uses for the situation, the leader practices honesty, support, caring, and doing the right thing. So let's do a few cases on leadership and workplace ethics. Here's the first one. You are the shift supervisor for Steely Steel Company. The hourly employees who are under you are protected by a union contract. Even though you are their supervisor, you have a good relationship with your workers. You treat them with respect, and they enjoy working for you. The one exception is Bob. Bob is a senior worker, is 56 years old, who does the least amount of work possible. He operates a machine and produces the barely standard rate, often with more than twice the average number of defective parts. But since he makes the minimum, he is meeting his obligations. Bob ignores any attempts you make to motivate him. He reacts badly to your discussions and suggestions, insists that his work is not below union standards. Bob is uncooperative and lacks the motivation to change. Your boss now suggests that you take steps to motivate Bob to seek employment elsewhere. We've got to get rid of him, he says. Since Bob is under union contract, he cannot be let go if he's meeting minimum standards. So your boss tells you to move Bob to the least desirable jobs and assign him to inconvenient night shifts. Your boss says, make life miserable for him so he'll want to quit. Now this is entirely legal, not a violation of the union contract, though it certainly violates the spirit of the contract. Your actions will surely be noticed and easily documented if Bob or the union decides to file a complaint. So what would you say to your boss? Take a few minutes to discuss it in your groups and then give your report. So if you do what your boss wants, you could be engaged in what we call leadership abuse. Leadership abuse occurs when someone in a position of power, such as a manager, abuses the position to gain something or undermine someone else. In other words, it's not ethical to treat your employees poorly and unfairly to force them to do what you want. We can apply virtue ethics and consequentialism in this situation. In virtue ethics, following your boss's instructions, that's going to reflect poorly on your character as a leader. And for consequentialism, the results actually is going to create more harm than benefit. So you might want to say to your boss, hey, boss, this is not a good idea. I currently have a good relationship with the workers, and this is going to ruin it. If they see me doing this to Bob, they're going to be thinking to themselves, I'm wondering if my boss is going to do this to me. They're not going to trust me anymore. It's going to hurt morale and productivity, and that's not good for us or the company. Now we apply deontology, which is the rules and standards. We can say, well, initially it's not a violation of the union contract technically, but it certainly violates the spirit of the contract. That's what the case says, the spirit of the contract. And so you might say to your boss, Bob still has grounds to file a complaint. Because the spirit of the contract is the intention, the purpose of the contract. Former CFO of Enron, Andy Fastow, says it's dangerous to ignore the principles or the spirit behind the rules because it's possible to follow the rules and still commit fraud and be misleading. Fastow, he went to jail for fraud, and he thought at the time, well, I was doing the right thing because I was still following all the rules. But he realized that just following the letter of the law is not good enough. Let's take a look at our second case here. The scene is a conference room at Allied Products Incorporated, where Tim, who's the senior employee, and Frank, who's the manager, and Alice, who's the human resources person, have been interviewing candidates for a job. Now here's the dialogue. Tim, geez, that last candidate was really sorry looking. Manager Frank, too ugly to work here, that's for sure. And those thick glasses didn't help. Still, he wasn't as ugly as that woman we hired a few months ago. Well, what was her name? Allison? Wow, she was enormous. And remember that hair of hers? It wasn't surprising that we had to let her go. Alice, come on, Frank. Don't be so hung up on looks. That last guy was well qualified for the job. He really knew his stuff, and he certainly was enthusiastic about working for Allied. Manager Frank, hey, don't get me wrong, Alice. I know you don't have to be beautiful to work for Allied. After all, look at Tim here. Still, I'm not going to hire a guy for my team with a face like that. So is Manager Frank wrong to reject the candidate? So how many of you would say A, yes, it's illegal to discriminate based on physical attractiveness in Canada? Or how many of you would say B, no, Frank has a right to reject a candidate based on looks? Or how many of you would say C, yes, it's ethically wrong to discriminate based on looks, but it's not illegal? Well, C is the right answer. Yes, it's ethically wrong to discriminate based on looks, but it's not illegal. As one lawyer said, physical attractiveness is not a ground that is protected by human rights legislation in Canada, and therefore hiring decisions made on that basis, while they may not be advisable HR practice, would not be illegal. And the Harvard Law Review says that physical attractiveness discrimination provides a window on the criteria that our society uses to distinguish among people. It represents one of the ways in which we use hazy and illegitimate criteria to separate good from bad, acceptable from unacceptable, and normal from deviant. Now consider this situation from the 1960s. Back in 1965, if you wanted to work as a flight attendant for an airline, first of all, you had to be a woman because they only hired women flight attendants. And then you had to meet these requirements. You had to be single. You had to have a proportionate figure. You needed to be thin. You need to be, in terms of height, between 5'2" and 5'9". You had to be attractive. You couldn't wear glasses. You had to be young, between the ages of 21 and 27, and you could only work for a maximum of 10 years or no older than 32 or 35 years old. One airline said 32, another airline said 35 years old. Now, they did hire black women at that time. In fact, I was talking to a older woman, she's black, and she actually worked for a airline as a flight attendant back in the 60s. And she told me back then she would have to sign a statement saying that she would retire at 32 years old. See, back then, airlines thought that they could lure businessmen onto their airlines because if they had single, attractive women. So that's why they did it. So in Canada today, the law protects you from certain types of discrimination. So which of the above attributes do you think violate current law? Well, the answer is today, the law protects you from these requirements if they were required for employment. Single, between the ages of 21 and 27 years old, can only work for a maximum of 10 years or no older than 32 or 35. See, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, they protect you from discrimination based on age, marital status. So the other requirements like height, proportionate figure, being thin, wearing no glasses, attractive, well, these are attributes not protected under discrimination law. So in other words, the law does not protect you from physical attractive or physical facial discrimination. Now, mind you, those who were hired as flight attendants did enjoy the job. One flight attendant said it was one of the best jobs a woman could get back in 1960s. I spoke languages. I wanted to travel. It was a very exclusive job and difficult to get. There was nothing else open for women unless you wanted to be a secretary. Every man wanted to go out with either a Pan Am stewardess or a model. You were absolutely admired, which can be fun, and you had quite a lot of compliments, people being kind to you. I quite enjoyed the male attention and felt flattered by it. Another flight attendant said, it really was the most glamorous job in the world, like being a supermodel or an actress today. Now here is the photo of the 1970s uniform. They wore hot pants. And I remember hearing on the news back in the 70s when the airline had as their uniform hot pants, they said that in order to work as a flight attendant, they would have to inspect your legs to make sure that your legs were attractive enough. So that was a hiring practice back in the 1960s and 70s. There was a lot of discrimination. There was discrimination against women. There was discrimination based on age. There was discrimination based on race. Now, there was physical discrimination based on appearance, but that hasn't changed to current times. Again, the law does not protect you from physical discrimination. So I want to ask you this question. Is it ever ethically justified to hire based on physical appearance? Well, the answer, it is justified to hire on the basis of physical appearance when it's a real requirement of the job. For example, if you want to get a job as a model or an actress. Some companies today are trying to do something to avoid facial or physical discrimination. For example, the American Symphony Orchestra, they hold auditions where candidates play behind a screen so that the judges can't see what they look like. Now let's switch gears here and talk about the case of dating in the workplace. Some companies have restrictive or no dating policies. For example, Airbnb, they have this policy where you can only ask another employee on a date once. So you've only got one crack at it. If the person says no, well, that's it. You can't ask again. Additionally, it can't be someone in your chain of management, so it can't be your boss or someone on your team. So let me ask you, do you agree with this policy? Yes or no? Well, let me just say that the policy can be justified because the intention is to protect workers from sexual harassment. When there's someone who cannot take no for an answer, that can turn into harassment at work, and you don't want that. Here's Tinder's policy, and of course Tinder is a dating site. So they say we don't prohibit workplace dating, but there are restrictions when the relationship is between a manager and a subordinate. We ask you to inform us if you are engaging in a romantic relationship with a manager or subordinate to avoid any potential conflicts of interest and ensure that all employees feel comfortable in the workplace. See, it's always a problem, if a manager asks a subordinate out because the subordinate is concerned about, if I say no, well, I might lose my job. So there's a power difference there. Well, the fact is there is a lot of dating and relationship issues in the workplace. According to this survey, 57% report workplace relationships have impacted their work performance. 43% have married someone they worked with. Now, that's not a bad thing. 35% don't report their relationship to their employer. 40% have cheated on their current partner with a coworker. Now, that's bad. And 50% report flirting with their coworkers. So again, relationships and dating can be tricky in the workplace. And companies need to craft careful policies which allow dating on the one hand, but also protect employees from harassment. So let's consider one last case on harassment. And this is a real case, it really happened. A man and a woman are working together on a project at work. It's after hours and no one else is in the office. The woman is tired, so she takes off her shoes and puts her feet up on the desk. Her male coworker is sitting across from her and starts playing with her feet with his pen. Well, the woman jumps up angrily and shouts at him, "That's sexual harassment." So what do you think? A, it definitely was sexual harassment. Or B, give the guy a break. He was just having a little fun and didn't do anything wrong. Or C, it may not technically be sexual harassment, but it was certainly inappropriate. Now the answer is C, it may not technically be sexual harassment, but it was certainly inappropriate. Now, how can a guy know if it was appropriate or not? Well, here's a test. He needs to ask himself one question. Would I do the same thing if this were a man's feet?